Greetings, loyal listeners and new recruits. I'm Drew Deach.
I'm Travis Newton.
And this is Genre Vision. Every week, Travis and I review and recommend horror films, action movies, fantasy flicks, sci-fi cinema, and more. And this week, we're coming back to Global Gonzo with Beyond the Door, an Exorcist ripoff that was actually sued for being an Exorcist ripoff. I'm sure we'll talk about that once we get to it, but real quick, just a couple calls to action. We would like to thank all of our Patreon people at patreon.com/genrevision. We have a pre-show for this episode that's going to be going up, and we're actually going to make it available to all listeners, even if you don't have a Patreon account, because we talk about some stuff that's going on, including, I do have to announce with me that I'm going to be going through a pretty significant life change. I'm going to be having to move out of state in the coming week, and it's quite possible that that is going to affect next week's episode for Genre Vision.
It may affect it so much that there may not even be an episode, a traditional episode next week. We had scheduled an episode for next week, but this is a significant enough change for Drew that we just may not have the ability to record an episode in that time frame. So if that is the case, we have something else that we'll put up in the feed as sort of a substitution. Our apologies, but also I think you guys are cool. You'll understand.
Yes, and we promise to do our absolute best to get things back on track the following week. We have an episode scheduled that week, and we're going to do our best. But thank you for understanding in this moment of upheaval in my life. And real quick, we just want to celebrate a little thing. Our YouTube channel, youtube.com/genrevision, reached 1,000 subscribers today. If you're one of the people that listens to the show on YouTube or has discovered the show through YouTube, hello and thank you. We have not been uploading a ton of original video content to YouTube. We're just posting the podcast episodes and an occasional little video thing here or there, like Travis did his thing about how to properly set up and use the Blue Yeti mic. We are incredibly grateful to have reached 1,000 subscribers, and now that we're there, we're certainly hoping that in the future we're going to be able to take advantage of the YouTube platform in some significant way. We don't know what that is, but thank you so much. It's incredible that we're still getting out there and still getting recognized and found by new listeners. So thanks.
Thank you indeed. All right, is it time to go Beyond the Door?
Yes, it's back. We've been gone from Global Gonzo for what seems like too long, and we're returning this time, checking out an Italian ripoff film, Beyond the Door. As I said in the in the intro, that there was a lawsuit from Warner Brothers for suing that it was copyright infringement against the film for being an Exorcist ripoff. And we've certainly covered ripoff films on this show and our other show, Finflix. And Beyond the Door was always this kind of infamous ripoff film on my radar. It's like, oh, that's the big Exorcist ripoff movie. And part of the reason I think it was even on the radar at all is because looking up, this was not only a very seemingly direct ripoff movie if you look at it from the surface, but an extremely profitable one, not only in foreign markets, but in the US as well.
Yeah, Beyond the Door was originally released in 1974 in its native Italy, but was discovered by this guy named Edward L. Montoro, who was this owner of a distribution and production company called Film Ventures International. It was headquartered in Georgia. And he would not only, produce films, but also acquire films, particularly from Italy, that he thought would do well in the United States. And the original budget for Beyond the Door, when it was produced in Italy, was it was produced both in Italy and the United States. It shot like almost all of its exteriors in the U.S., but the budget was like $350,000. It made, just in the U.S., $15 million on a production budget of $350,000 US.
That's huge.
And that doesn't even take into account what it made internationally. So Beyond the Door was a resounding success, financially speaking. But Warner Brothers was able to sue Edward L. Montoro and Film Ventures International And in 1979, they reached a settlement that basically said that, yeah, okay, copyright was infringed. And I can't speak to the merits of that lawsuit or whether or not it was really, really warranted. I can tell you that similar lawsuits today typically don't end with that result.
The only prominent one I can think of that actually has won was that Luc Besson, I think it was called Lockout or something.
Right. It was a Escape from New York thing. But people have also filed lawsuits like, oh, Cabin in the Woods was actually based on my unpublished novel, or, Gravity was actually based on my novel, also called Gravity, which is also about an astronaut. And it's like, these sort of like concurrent developments with similar ideas happen in Hollywood all the time.
But now, many years later, obviously Beyond the Door, or as the copy we watched is titled The Devil Within Her.
Yeah. Mine actually had two titles. The opening title was The Devil Within Her, and then when the end credits rolled, it was Beyond the Door. It was like watching fucking Death Proof.
Yes. But obviously it's always going to have this aura around it as an Exorcist ripoff, and if you would watch any trailer from it, you can see the similarities, and I'm sure we'll talk about those. But now, many years later, watching it on its own merits, Beyond the Door is a really interesting, fascinating, weirdo little movie. It's certainly got surface elements of Exorcist, but it's actually narratively more of a riff on Rosemary's Baby.
Right. It was more of an appropriation of just what was going on with demon possession and Satanism in American cinema at the time. It was the Italian market saying, what can we produce that's similar aesthetically and tonally that, Italians will go to see? And so they made this movie, and it's directed by, or direction is credited to two people. And those two people are Ovidio Assonitis, who is a famous European, it's like a Greek-Italian guy who was actually born in Egypt, but he made all these like weird rip-off Italian movies. He was associated with The Visitor. He was actually producer and had a story credit on the movie The Visitor that we reviewed a couple of years back. That movie's incredible, by the way.
Tons of stuff. Tentacles, Piranha 2, The Spawning, a whole bunch of films that are primarily known to exploitation fans. But yes, he has a co-directing credit with Robert Barrett on this. Yeah. But while Robert Barrett uses his real name, as was often the case in these days, whenever Italian or any kind of foreign outlet were making movies that they intended to play in America or come across as being American productions, looking like American productions, they would often assume pseudonyms that made them sound American. So for this one, Ovidio Assonitis went with the pseudonym of Oh Hellman.
Yeah. The first initial O and then Hellman. It's like a Simpsons Treehouse of Horror credits name. It's so
exactly.
Stupid. Oh Hellman. It's like a Death Stranding name, or like
perfect.
Anyway, these guys, they made this wackadoo movie, and their credits on it are pretty much perfect. Oh Hellman.
Well, seeing those pop up in the credits kind of set me up in the right mood for the movie. And then when the movie starts rolling and we get an idea of what's going on, because the immediate beginning of the movie actually had me thrown for a loop, because it's all this very disconnected psychedelic imagery.
It's a shot of like candles in darkness, and then there's this very ominous voiceover that, according to the credits, could actually be distributor Edward L. Montoro, who recorded the English VO as, quote, the devil.
Yes, that he is uncredited as Satan. And this opening shot where it's just a void with all these candles in it, I was like, okay.
Wins! Is it Bram Stoker's Dracula reference for your ass?
Yes. Go listen to that episode that we did. So this starts, and then all of a sudden we see images of Richard Johnson, who people might know from The Haunting. Go listen to our episode on The Haunting. And he shows up, and there's like this glowing pentagram table with a naked woman on top of it, but then her face kind of is morphing into what might be his face. he's also having images of himself driving his red convertible car off of a cliff while this voiceover is saying stuff like, Dimitri, 10 years, you only have 10 years, Dimitri. And we're like, what the fuck is going on?
The beginning of this film is so disjointed that it creates this sort of dreamlike state. And this is actually quite extended for as much information as it gives you, which is very little. For it to go on this long is like a huge mystery. It's like, what the fuck is going on here? And so it eventually comes to this point where Dimitri, played by Richard Johnson, is eventually like careening off a cliff in his car, and we understand that whatever this is happening to him, this accident is potentially being caused by the devil, who has some relationship to this bearded guy in a convertible, Dimitri. And then the movie changes gears, and we are introduced to this. He's like a music producer, record executive. And he's played by this Italian actor named Gabriele Lavia, and he's been in a whole bunch of other Italian movies that you actually might recognize. He was in Dario Argento's Inferno. He was in Deep Red. But I mean, he's got such a signature look. He's evidently, it's his real hair in the movie, but he's got this really wiggy hair. And he plays the husband. They've dubbed him over completely. That's Italian cinema 101, is just dub him over.
This is not a case where actors are speaking their native language and then dubbing over to whatever. He is clearly speaking English and then being dubbed.
Yeah, it's not a bad dub. Like, as far as Italian cinema goes, there have been way worse dubs.
But the way he's introduced is so interesting, because there is this soul group.
So it's like a funk band in a recording studio.
Yeah, and there is, as far as I remember, I think all of the members of this group are black.
Yeah. And
he is berating them for some reason about, you need to hit on the down tempo or whatever thing he's saying.
He eventually chastises them to the point where he's like, it sounds like a jerk off session in a bathroom. They're playing the absolute hell out of this funk track.
It's so good, this track.
Almost the entirety of the original music for the film is funk, and it was all composed by this Italian composer guy named Franco Michalizzi. It's like a weird funk disco hybrid, but it's really good music. You can actually go out and buy the soundtrack. Fortunately, it has not been lost to time. Much like this movie, it's out there if you want to get it. There's actually a new Blu-ray restoration of this film thanks to Arrow Films that you can watch, and it's like, hey, this flick looks pretty good, and it sounds pretty good, and the funk soundtrack adds this really unique aspect, this really distinct flavor that separates it from just being a ripoff of The Exorcist. So this funk band is playing the hell out of one of these Franco Michalizzi tunes, and this guy the whole time is berating them and saying how awful it sounds, but it's actually intercutting between this record executive and his wife. Like, whenever the band is playing and it sounds good, we're seeing footage of this guy's wife driving around in yet another red convertible with her two kids, and they're just running errands. They're going to the grocery store.
Yes, and then this is when we get the title, which on our copy is The Devil Within Her. And this is Jessica, played by Juliette Mills. And I think Juliette Mills is part of the reason why this movie has managed to have staying power. Her performance in this movie isn't messing around. Like, she is committed to this role, because what she eventually reveals is that she is pregnant, and they have these two kids. Their names are Ken and Gail. And these two kids, the kids are the weirdest thing about the movie in terms of how the movie decides to utilize them for the plot, and because they've also been dubbed over, and the dubbing over that's done for the kids is wackadoo.
Sure. I mean, the kids are intended from the start to be kind of joke characters, like they're comic relief for the movie.
But they're also terrors.
Oh, completely. The way that they decide to characterize these children is so totally alien. I mean, like, American movies don't attempt to do like the kind of stuff that this is doing, because there's actually a lot of commentary in how they decide to characterize these kids. Like when they're riding around in the back of their mom's convertible, running to get groceries while the funk soundtrack is playing. We see some really strange details, like the son, which is actually the younger of the two, who maybe looks like, I don't know, 5, 4, something like that. He is drinking with a straw a can of Campbell's pea soup, which is obviously an Exorcist joke.
Yes, and this continues throughout the movie. We see a painting, a poster in his bedroom of like an Andy Warhol, like Campbell's green pea soup thing. Later, when we see them filling up a lunchbox, it's filled with like nothing but green pea soup. This is such a weird little fun joke. But then the daughter, Gail, is continually reading the popular book Love Story.
Yeah.
Which was made into the very popular movie. But what's weird is she has tons of copies of the book, and she continually reads one copy and then finishes it and then picks up another copy of it.
And the kids are both revoiced by children that are several years older than the actors that they used on set. So the boy is voiced by another boy that sounds like 8 or 9 maybe, and then the girl is voiced by some other girl who sounds maybe 13 or 14. It's so strange.
And the best thing about the girl is that she is vulgar.
She's very vulgar. Well, they try to sort of make her alarmingly played above her age, like she's growing up too fast. Like she has a lot of profanity, and then actually so does the boy, believe it or not, because he kind of repeats whatever he hears. And then the fact that she's speaking, kind of focused on all these love stories and things like that, like there's definitely some elements of commentary of like, what is it we're giving our kids? The Campbell's soup thing not only is just an Exorcist joke, but it's also sort of a weird consumerist thing, where the kid is so obsessed with this brand that he actually has a poster of it above his bed. It's so strange.
Well, there's weird commentary, like I have to believe it's commentary. At a point later in the movie, a character says that evil cannot create, it can only repeat itself.
Yeah.
And I think about that with the kids, where it's like all they're doing is repetitively eating the same thing or repetitively reading the same book. And this is a movie that, our lead character, Jessica, is pregnant. She eventually finds herself feeling sick at a birthday party and runs into a bathroom and starts vomiting up blood into the sink. And you're like, whoa, this is what's going on here. Eventually it's revealed that when she should, just be, I think, like a couple weeks pregnant, that they're like, oh, the fetus is actually 3 months, she's 3 months pregnant. And it's like, oh, so this is some weird advanced, growth in this thing, because we're going to find out it's a demon baby. So this is a movie that is actually kind of attacking ideas of, the common thing that you're told as a member of society is like, oh yes, you're supposed to procreate and have kids, and kids are wonderful and the miracle of life and all this stuff. I have to believe this movie is genuinely taking that idea to task. And it's an idea that we often do not see in popular fiction,
or we at least do not see it approached in this way. Like, because we still have plenty of scary kid movies, right? And that genre, particularly in US made horror, is so well worn that it's just tired beyond belief. The Exorcist is a scary kid movie, where you have this little girl who starts speaking beyond her years and using all these vulgarities. It's so horrifying, but the creepy kid horror, as seen in Beyond the Door, takes an entirely different approach, where the kids are displaying certain knowledge, like, profane knowledge beyond their years, but it's done in a way that's almost feels like silly and innocent. And the majority of the perspective being from Jessica talks about having children is horror, even if the kids aren't like stereotypically creepy kids. I like that it sort of avoids what we think of as like creepy kid tropes in American horror.
The horror is mostly centered through Jessica, because she starts to become incredibly violent as far as her mood. Like she'll be incredibly affectionate towards Robert, and then 5 seconds later be angry and cursing at him and stuff. She starts to experience these kind of paranormal incidents where like she's awakened in the night by some weird huffing voice and she's levitating through the air.
Evidently the voice of Edward L. Montoro.
There's this great shot where the youngest kid, Ken, comes into the bedroom and he's opened the door and he's completely backlit. So he's in silhouette and there's like this halo of light over his head and the camera pans down to Jessica in the bed and there's just a single light on one of her eyes and her eye is open.
Yeah.
It's genuinely freaky.
This movie does not look bad. Like let's say right now, like even though this is commonly regarded as a rip-off movie, the craft here is never bad. The lighting is very theatrical. In the interiors, it has a different approach, obviously, because they're not using any natural light. But cinematographically, like the movie almost always looks really good, and the job that Arrow did to make it look its best is like, okay, great, thanks very much. Like the movie had been in high def before, but Arrow's restoration of evidently some good print is like, oh wow, you guys actually treated this movie with a fair amount of respect, and maybe the respect it deserved, because the craft is on point.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing, is that I always am interested in these so-called rip-off movies because they're always immediately dismissed because of that status, because it's like, oh well, it's just a rip-off movie, so it can't have any quality on its own. And as is the case with Beyond the Door, there is legitimate filmmaking going on. Not just in, like you're saying, the restoration, like it's a good looking movie. The idea of where to place the camera at certain times is smart. For example, there's this extended sequence in the kid's bedroom where it's just the two of them and they're talking and they're having this, there's a creepy conversation of like, oh, there's a rocking chair in the room where Ken, the youngest, is saying like, oh yeah, there's somebody, there, and they're sitting there rocking in this chair. It's like, that's creepy.
Sure.
And then all of a sudden, all this weird poltergeist stuff happens. And I mean that in both.
Well, just the shots of their toys moving and stuff like that. Keep in mind, this was released in 1974. That's 8 years before Poltergeist was released in the US.
Well, that's what I wanted to say, is it's not just Poltergeist the movie. I mean, poltergeist is a term thing where it's like, right, oh, all these things are moving around. But this moment, you and I both were like, yeah, did Steven Spielberg see this movie? Did Tobe Hooper see this movie? Because this feels a lot like that kind of kid horror in Poltergeist, where these toys start moving around and dolls' eyes are lighting up and laughing. And then, this is what I wanted to get to about the filmmaking, is this is all on a set. So they put the camera at a bird's eye view above the set, and there is this light coming in through the floorboards. Yeah. It's awesome.
Now, it works really, really well. Evidently, what they did as far as production is that the majority of the exteriors and perhaps some of the interiors were shot in San Francisco. And then most of the other interiors were shot in Italy, just because it was cheaper to produce an Italian film there. But the fact that they shot so much of the exteriors in San Francisco and used some of the natural, look of the city and the surrounding areas, like they get a ton of production value out of it. The movie ends up looking really, really good. Like the scene where we first meet the mom and her two children, Jessica and the kids, where she's driving around, like they managed to hit every fucking San Francisco landmark. You see the Golden Gate Bridge, you see the name of I forget what the name of the street is, but the sort of the curving street that goes down. And, you get the sense it's like, okay, they're milking every single cent of production value out of the San Francisco exteriors that they can. And throughout the movie, as long as they're using San Francisco exteriors, it looks really good. The third act changes a bit because it's almost all interior, but it never looks horribly cheap. Yeah, I think there's one or two gags, like in this poltergeist scene that we were talking about where the toys are moving, where you can see wires. But you know what? You can see wires in the fucking Exorcist. So don't at me.
Well, it's interesting you talk about The Exorcist, because if there's an image from The Exorcist that immediately everybody's going to go to and is going to relate to this film being a ripoff. It is the moment, I believe it happens twice in The Exorcist, in which Regan's head spins around. And this moment does happen in Beyond the Door, but it's very different. It is much more nightmarish, and in the sense that it feels like a dream. I think it is, I can't remember if it's the kid Ken or her husband Robert who comes in and she is laying on the bed.
It's the
and
kid.
She has her face, and she has her face down in the pillow. And then her real head is, for this gag that they're using, is spinning around, and she has that horrible smile on her face.
And those yellow contact lenses in. It's a great fucking gag.
Yeah, I said to you, I was like, I think in terms of creepiness, this actually is better than The Exorcist. The Exorcist moments, it's shocking. It's extremely shocking when it happens.
Yeah.
But in terms of pure, shivery, eeriness, I think Beyond the Door takes it.
The execution of the gag is awesome. Of course, it's calling back to the Exorcist head turning around gag, but they actually managed to do it here in a way that is not just replicating the same setup. And they're actually doing it in a way that's maybe a little bit more clever. I think it's brilliant filmmaking. So Jessica, as we know, is having this accelerated demonic pregnancy during this time where she's, having these weird personality shifts and sometimes, not wanting the pregnancy to go forward and seeming like her normal self and being the same sort of loving wife that she's always been to her asshole record executive husband. She's also doing things like looking through old photographs. And when she starts looking through old photographs, she sees a photograph of herself with Dimitri, the character who we met in the opening, the guy in the red convertible who careens off the cliff. And she looks at this photo, and there's a sound effect on the soundtrack that sounds like wind. Whoosh. And I said, that's a very windy photograph. So evidently the movie is implying that she has had a past with this man. And that's all we really get as far as the movie's exposition as to what's going on with her and why. There is, in that opening scene with these sort of dreamlike black void images with the woman on the pentagram table, we see Jessica in sort of ritual garb. She refuses something and runs away out of the black void set. And then it's well, okay, evidently something happened in Jessica's prior life where she knew this guy Dimitri, and she found out the devil wanted to blow a baby up in her, and she wasn't terribly happy about that. The movie totally drops the ball when it comes to plot. We never know any more than that. The movie is not concerned with telling us exactly why these things happen. The movie was not made for that sort of stuff. It was made to kind of capitalize on the aesthetic elements that people found interesting about The Exorcist. And that was a successful approach because the fucking movie made money.
As an experiment in tone and mood and filmmaking, I think Beyond the Door is really good.
Most of the time, yeah.
But when we come to the subject of Dimitri has continued to pop up throughout the movie. They'll be out somewhere in public, Jessica will be walking and she sees a rotten banana peel and just picks it up and starts eating it.
I love that. I also love that the movie follows her around San Francisco for an alarmingly long time before that happens.
Yes, and she'll be looking in a store window or something, and this Dimitri will be somewhere. He's following her, he's watching her, and we're like, okay, what's the connection? What's happening here? When he finally fully integrates himself into the story by approaching Jessica's husband Robert, and they have another friend who's a doctor that Jessica goes to see about having an abortion at one point, but then the demon in her is like, no, you're a murderer.
This happened in The fucking Visitor too, didn't it?
Yes, yeah.
And the OBGYN was played by Sam Peckinpah.
In that one, yes.
Holy fuck, we watched some weird movies.
Well, and again, especially for 1974, and this was certainly in Rosemary's Babies as well, the idea of even having a woman on screen talking about hey, I want to have an abortion. I don't want to have this baby. Again, strengthens that thematic discussion about, hey, maybe having kids and procreating isn't necessarily the best thing if this is, if it's going to do these kinds of horrific things to you. Obviously, this is an exaggerated setting, but the movie is talking about this kind of stuff?
Well, Roe v. Wade, that decision was made in 1973, and Beyond the Door comes out in 74. And so one of the primary conflicts in Beyond the Door is all about Jessica's reproductive autonomy, about whether or not she, as an individual woman, a person, a human being, is going to decide for herself whether it's the right thing to bring a baby into this world or not. And there is a scene where she goes to her obstetrician and says she doesn't want this to happen. But then there's sort of a demonic possession that takes over that's like, how dare you, want to take my baby from me? And so there's this back and forth of, should this child be born? Should this child not be born? And, Dimitri and the the demonic presence in the film, whether it's the devil or, Edward L. Montoro himself, whoever it is constantly saying the child must be born. So thematically, it is no mystery. This movie is directly about women's reproductive autonomy.
Well, and it being taken over by the wants of men.
Yes.
And so what we come to find out is that Dimitri apparently made some pact with the devil, and I guess the devil saved him from dying in this car crash that we saw in the opening. And Dimitri's been allowed to live for 10 years, but after the 10 years, he's going to die unless Dimitri facilitates the birth of this baby who is going to be the Antichrist or just be Satan's new vessel, something. This is where things get a little too vague and not hammered down enough, because all this time we're having like fun, crazy, demon stuff happening. For example, there's a great shot of Dimitri kneeling in front of the door of Jessica's bedroom, because that's where she's holed up while she's getting all demon crazy, because it's an Exorcist ripoff.
Sure.
And the shot is through, like, Dimitri's in the foreground, and then the door is kind of cracked open, and we can just see Jessica on the bed all demoned out and everything. Again, great framing, great filmmaking going on in this movie, but the movie loses a lot of steam in its third act because it feels like it is just sitting down and kind of bullshitting time for this baby to be born. Nothing's really moving the story or the characters forward.
Right. Yeah. Structurally, the third act is where the movie kind of falls apart. And the first two acts manage to be like really enjoyable because the technical stuff is really, really good. Like we've talked about the filmmaking just on a technical level, just being solid all around. And it is. The kid stuff, the two kids that are living in this woman's house, the scenes with them are so strange and so enjoyable that they become sort of the immediate and obvious standout of the entire film. And even the scenes, especially from their perspective, like that poltergeist-esque scene that we talked about earlier, for me is kind of like the scene that I will always remember from this movie because it's so good. And then once the movie turns over to the third act, it's just a matter of like, well, okay, Dimitri says that Jessica has to have this baby. Jessica is possessed. The baby's possessed. The record producer husband is just like around, but not able to do anything at all.
He's a complete non-character after a point, except as what I have to again believe is legitimate commentary from the movie. He is introduced berating a group of black artists for their music. And later in the movie, he is walking around San Francisco, and these street musicians, these black street musicians, come up on him and start playing their music. One of them, who is playing a recorder through his nose, which is just so surreal and bizarre to me.
By the way, this funk track that's playing during this scene fucking rips. It's so good.
It rips, but like the lyrics are saying something I can't remember, and I wish I should have written it down, but like they're berating him in some way, and he clearly feels like he is being oppressed by these street musicians who are right up in his face, like grinning, playing bongos and playing their nose recorder, and they're just grinning and up in his face, and it's like, this feels meaningful. I can't nail down the exact commentary I think it's going for, but I think it's going for something.
One of the reasons these scenes feel meaningful, or one of the reasons that we're like walking away from these scenes with the with the sensation of like this has to mean something, is because these scenes go on for so long. Like if I had to say like the movie had, you know, a couple big problems, one of them would be that scenes just don't go out soon enough. Mm-hmm. The majority of the scenes last maybe a little too long. They could get out a little bit earlier. But, you know, particularly once we get into that third act zone where the conflict is, you know, trying to be really, really present all the time, scenes just fucking stretch on too long. They need to get out like a minute earlier or sometimes even more. The scenes just have nothing more of value to offer, and so they just last way too long.
Well, like I said, and like you said about having nothing to offer, is that nothing feels like it is progressing. While weird stuff may still be going on, it doesn't feel like the dial is being moved at all.
Right. You know, Dimitri keeps saying the child must be born, so we get the sense that inevitably there will be a child born in this film.
Well, there's still fun supernatural stuff going on. Like at one point, Jessica seems to have multiple copies of herself in her room.
That's fun.
She's, you know, spitting up this very distinct green vomit that is not the bright green pea soup vomit of The Exorcist, but this dark, like black green goo, and she's licking it and puking it over Dimitri and saying like, "Come lick the whore's vomit," and shit like that.
But I mean, it's very clear that these are the kind of scenes that got this movie in court. You know, it's like, okay, well, you know, this possessed woman puking up this green stuff all over this one dude is clearly what got this movie, you know, in legal trouble. The false teeth, the contact lenses, the greasy hair.
The whole look of Juliette Mills. I am not going to sit here and defend the movie as not a ripoff, but I do want to reiterate, Juliette Mills is going for it here, not in a camp way, not in a self-aware satirical way. She is playing this part, and I think she deserves some real credit for it.
Totally agreed. She is acting her butt off. She gets some, you know, they actually do a fair amount, I feel like, to support her in the film. She even gets a scene early on in the film with another woman, you know, another woman character with whom she actually gets to talk about things that aren't related to men in the story. So, believe it or not, the movie passes the so-called Bechdel test. It gets to earn that merit badge. And the film does a fair amount of, you know, grounding itself in her perspective, which I was glad to see. She gets some really nice costumes. You know, she's shot well. So it's like, okay, I feel like this character is actually given a fairly good treatment in the film, except for in the third act.
Well, but because you're talking about pure texture stuff, like this will be our only opportunity to ever say it. So there is a sink in Beyond the Door.
The big red sink.
The big red sink that immediately, I mean, made me think of the bathroom in The Shining, which this was, of course, you know, 6 years before that. But this sink we get to come back to, because the first time Travis sent me a message like, "Oh my God, I love this sink." And I was like, yeah, it's pretty cool. And then we came back to him like, yeah, I love this sink too. Like it's such a bold decision just visually. And kind of, I mean, the first time we ever see it, she's literally puking up blood into this like Argento red sink. Mm-hmm. It's wonderful. I really like the set design and the look of this apartment, because that's where we are most of the time. Again, both of the directors, they find really great ways to shoot this set and make it look visually interesting. But yeah, this third act is just when the movie loses a lot of steam, and it's unfortunate even rolling into the very climax of when the demon baby's supposed to be born, and this is all coming to a head. Haha. I don't even really remember exactly how the ending of this all goes down.
Well, she eventually does give birth to this demonic baby because, according to the devil, the baby must be born. And so Dimitri, throughout the movie, is stalking Jessica's husband. You know, this Italian guy playing a record producer. Eventually they meet up, and the husband comes to understand that Dimitri may be Jessica's only hope of surviving whatever this process is. And so, he invites Dimitri into the apartment. There are the sort of Exorcist-esque scenes of Jessica shouting at Dimitri in demonic voices and puking all over him. And of course, like I said, these scenes just go on way too fucking long. The only fun moment that happens in this, overlong third act is eventually, I think that the husband character sees an eyeball in his cocktail glass, and he throws the glass, and we see a POV shot of the eyeball as the camera spins wildly and eventually lands on the ground, and then the eyeball dissolves. That's a fun shot, but it really is just a free-floating moment in this really boring third act. And eventually Jessica has the baby, and Dimitri, or the husband, comes in and removes the cloth from the baby's face to see it's just a baby that doesn't have a mouth. Like, its mouth has sort of been fleshed over with a really bad optical effect. And reading the Wikipedia synopsis for the film, it says the baby is stillborn, which is not an impression that I got from watching the film.
It's not communicated at all, other than in a following scene we see that there is no baby. But another dramatic thing that happens here is that this whole thing, Dimitri has been trying to get this baby born because he believes it will keep him alive with this deal that he's made with the devil.
Right.
And during this birthing scene, the entity inside of Jessica is saying, like, I was never going to do that. I just, messed with you for my own amusement, which is fun. I really like when Juliette Mills gets to, do so. It's not her voice, obviously, but her acting as the demon is really fun. I actually wish there was more extended sequences of it in the movie, as far as getting to hear the demon speak more.
Yeah, Juliette Mills does a good job acting that kind of stuff out. But I mean, even in these final 10 minutes of the movie, her OBGYN is going out and doing detective work, and it ultimately means nothing to the movie. It's like, what? Why?
Well, yeah, because he's interacting with characters we've never seen before that are giving this backstory about who Dimitri is and what his relationship is to Jessica. And this is literally in the last 10 minutes of the movie.
Right.
And so we were like, this is just structure-wise, this needed to come way earlier. Uh-huh. This is just not the right place for this to be happening.
Well, and he disappears from the movie after that.
Yeah, it doesn't... while it tells us something that we needed to know, it tells it at the wrong time.
Right. And it doesn't give it to a perspective character in a way that would actually be meaningful to any of the main characters at all. So it's like, well, what's the value of this information?
Right.
Negligible. And, it's a really poor choice in the movie's third act, because this is where I start to not recommend the film. Is like, well, if it had a better third act, I think this movie would be pretty fucking good, because the first 2/3 of it, it's like, well, yeah, some scenes stretch on a little too long, but otherwise, the first 2/3 of this movie are pretty fucking good.
I enjoyed it.
Really funny.
I still think there is some value to be had in that third act. Again, there's fun moments. There's still good filmmaking going on.
There is, but the scope of the story decreases so so drastically, and it's all in these interiors.
It's less a matter of scope for me as it is a matter of escalation.
Yeah,
there is a point where the escalation in this movie plateaus in the third act, and the things that it should be doing to keep that as learning new information, it's just all happening at the wrong time. Now, the movie does end in a typical Italian ending movie for this kind of flick, in which, we see that they're all okay and everything's fine. And then this box that I believe Dimitri dropped in the little boy Ken's lap early in the movie. And it's like, I guess this box has just been floating around. He finally opens it, and inside is a little toy car, a little convertible that looks like Dimitri's, and they're on some ferry or something in San Francisco, and Ken tosses the car over the side, and we see that Jessica and Robert and everybody are all fine, but then the kid turns and, he's got spooky glowy eyes, freeze frame, the end.
Right. So I think it's pretty clear to me that this movie has no clue how to end, because the first 2/3 are ripe with potential. And then the third act and the way that it ties everything up is just such a shrug. It's like, well, okay, we're going to place all this importance on this baby. The baby has to be born. Well, and then the baby has no mouth and then disappears from the movie. And then I read in the fucking Wikipedia synopsis that it was a stillbirth. And then the movie doesn't actually do anything to really tell us that.
No, I had no idea that was the case.
I felt robbed of a real ending. It was really extremely disappointing. And so to see this scene at the end where Dimitri sort of gets his just desserts, where the devil tortures him by, intercutting his death, plummeting off of a cliff, by intercutting it with the little kid, Ken, taking his red toy car and throwing it into the ocean. It's like, well, has this entire movie been like the death fantasy of, Dimitri's character? Like, what has this meant? Like, what happened with these characters? How did they change? How did they grow? It is a total nothing of an ending. And you and I think are in a pretty small minority when we talk about movies with weak endings. It's like, well, what did most of the movie do? It's like, if most of the movie was really good, but the ending was a little weak, I think we can forgive a weak ending, whereas a lot of people can't. If people walk out of a movie theater with the movie having just ended with a weak ending, a lot of people will say that the entire movie was bad. With this flick, I really feel like the entire third act of the film, or really the last third of the film, drops the ball so heavily that it's almost not worth recommending for folks who don't like this specific subgenre.
It's tough because I agree with that kind of like an ending does not a bad movie make. Mm-hmm. A bad ending does not a bad movie make, rather. And I think there is so much good on display in Beyond the Door throughout in terms of technical stuff, performance, effects, all this stuff. It's all fun. It's all executed very well. I mean, there was stuff that we didn't mention, very simple effects in the movie that are awesome. For example, a moment where Jessica is laying in bed and one of her eyes is frozen in place while the other one is rolling around her head, and it looks so surreal and creepy. And it is a simple effect that is achieved by just freezing half of the frame.
Yeah, it's beautiful work like that. I mean, it's a great effect and perfectly in line with what movies were doing in 1974 to accomplish things like that. Like, it's just awesome. And the movie's really funny. It's like, when it's at its best, the movie's producing like consistent laughs. I laughed a lot, and the movie is not unaware of the fact that it's silly.
And so I think all of that stuff throughout, even in the lackluster third act, is still strong. But yes, that third act is a big. It's not even a downshift in quality; it's a downshift in momentum, and I think that's a big minus against it. I'd still recommend this. I mean, of the movies that we've done on Global Gonzo so far, of the 3 that we've done, I have to say this is probably my least favorite, but it might actually be the best made.
With the kind of reputation that Exorcist II: The Heretic has, I would say that 2/3 of this movie are actually better at being an Exorcist sequel than The Heretic is. And they're really not about the same quality of filmmaking. Like, you and I are fans of Boorman. Mm. John Boorman, we think, is an incredible stylist and a really great filmmaker who makes interesting movies. But The Exorcist II feels almost stranger and more exploitative than this ripoff film does. And I say ripoff in this instance with a loving sense in my heart. The only failing it has is being able to land this thing, successfully with an ending. It doesn't have a very good ending, but as a film, an exercise in, the technique of filmmaking, it's probably worth a look. And the fact that it has survived this well on Blu-ray and in other HD formats, it's like, it's probably worth a look for a lot of horror fans who love The Exorcist.
I would agree. I think we can head on over to the shelf where we pick a movie that might act as a good pairing or substitute for our main topic. And as always, we want to encourage you, loyal listeners, to go to genrevision.com, comment on the post of this episode with your shelf picks, and we'll feature them on next week's episode. Travis, what are you going to pull off the shelf for Beyond the Door?
If you're looking for an Italian ripoff movie distributed by Edward L. Montoro in the United States that actually manages to stick the landing, I recommend you watch The Last Shark, aka Great White. Great White saw release in theaters in the United States for, I don't know, a week and a half before it was pulled due to the lawsuit. Because Great White, aka The Last Shark, is a clear ripoff of Jaws, and Universal went to court on this really, really quickly. And so Great White, aka The Last Shark, is not an easy film to get your hands on, but it is certainly worth your time if you love Jaws. The whole issue with the ending that we've talked about with Beyond the Door is not an issue that The Last Shark has. The Last Shark is consistently fun and funny throughout. And the ending, particularly where they figure out how to kill the shark, utterly hilarious. I love The Last Shark. We did an episode on it for our other show, Finflix, and it actually turned out to be one of our favorite episodes of Finflix ever. It is a hell of a good time. You can watch the Riff Tracks version of this through Amazon Prime, I believe. But if you can get your hands on The Last Shark, aka L'Ultimo Squalo, or Great White, through other means, I encourage you to do so. It is definitely worth your time.
You can't get the cut that says Great White. That has never been released because there's also an alternate score by Morton Stevens in that
which is
cut.
really good.
Yes, and I'm very bummed it's not on Spotify anymore because now I can't find it. Yes, the Great White version has never been released. You can only see the Last Shark version, which has a different Italian score. And
Prints of Great White do exist.
They do, but that is not readily available in any way. Although we might be better off with The Last Shark because it opens with the song Hollywood Big Time, which is I just adore. So now it's running through my head. But
yeah, the Italian score for that movie is really good. It's really fun.
So go check that out and go check out our Finflix episode on it. On my end, I'm going to pull off the shelf a movie we mentioned that's also connected to Ovidio Asinitas, Natitus, I don't know, and an episode that we've done on Genre Vision and one of my favorites, and it kind of is now an unofficial entrant in the global Gonzo canon. This is The Visitor. The Visitor is simply one of the craziest. This is from 1979, by the way, in case there's some other movie out there with that kind of a generic title. This is one of the nuttiest, most incredible movies I've ever seen. And I don't say that lightly. If you want to have some cursory idea of what it is, you can go listen to our Genre Vision episode of it, which is also one of my favorite episodes we've ever done of Genre Vision. But you need to seek this movie out. It's got stuff in it I've never seen in any other movie. Its mood and rhythm is unlike anything I've ever seen.
It's also like Beyond the Door. It's pretty fucking funny.
Yeah, it's got a great soundtrack, a wonderful funky theme that I love, and just tons of wackadoo stuff, and nothing that I would want to spoil on this episode.
And like the Last Shark, it was shot partially in Georgia, or mostly in Georgia.
Yes, and like Beyond the Door, it is trying to show off, like, no, this is taking place in America. We're trying to fool you into thinking this is an American film, when it feels like no American film you've ever seen.
Yeah, none of these movies ever get over their like Euro trash weirdness,
which is absolutely part of their charm.
Yeah.
So The Visitor, go listen to our episode, but more importantly, see that movie. Now I have to fly through the listener shelf picks for last week's episode on David Lynch's Dune because y'all came out to collect. Thank you so much. Eric Fuchs' shelf pick was End of Evangelion because, yes, that is also a trippy, weird sci-fi epic. JT's shelf pick, having not seen Dune, was Beetlejuice because of the sandworms. And yeah, Stephen Nesbella's shelf pick was Krull, which we've also done an episode on. Go listen to our Krull episode. Conan Zilla agreed with me and had a shelf pick of Blade Runner, and also Minority Report, which we did an episode of that, I believe, against War of the Worlds.
Yes.
Wall Drumpus recommended The Emperor's New Groove because of music from Sting. To which I'll also say everybody should look up the documentary The Sweat Box about the production of that movie, which was shot by Sting's wife, and very interesting. Just look that up. Mr. Milksteak's shelf pick was Prometheus, which is I like that pick. Cthulhu Bob's shelf pick was actually an episode of Babylon 5 called Passing Through Gethsemane, which stars Brad Dourif, because I mentioned the Garden of Gethsemane moment from the Jesus story. And finally, Eric Johnson's shelf pick was The Fifth Element, another kind of big budget spectacle sci-fi movie, and one we've never done here on the show. I don't know, maybe we'd find a good pairing for that. Who knows? Maybe one day. But thank you so much, everybody. I love seeing all these shelf picks every week. So wonderful. Bravo. Let's do some currently consuming. Nom, 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 nom. Travis, what's been on your plate?
Buffy. I've never really gotten into the whole Buffy the Vampire Slayer thing. I decided to get into it because, hey, no time like the present, right? All my work hours are cut back, and I have this free time that I need something to do with. I need some sort of escapism to fill the sucking void, right?
Go listen to our pre-show episode.
Yeah, please, which is free for you to listen to. So I suggest you do it. Buffy the Vampire Slayer is on Hulu, and so I watched the pilot. It's a 2-part pilot, and I was like, okay. Well, the pilot alludes to stuff happening that I know happened in the movie. So I'm going to watch the movie. So I watched the pilot, the 2-parter, and then I watched the movie. And I understand that the two are not directly in canon with one another, but, they're related enough that I needed to see them. And the movie is an interesting failure. It is almost successful as a consumerist satire, where you have this character who only cares about consumption and, what she wears and what she buys. And then she learns that there are other things. But the main problem with the movie is that it is kind of unsure of, what material from the script should be treated with any degree of sincerity and what should be a joke. And the movie errs on the side of treating it all like a joke. And I feel like that was completely wrong.
Yeah, I would say I don't dislike the Buffy movie. I wrote a piece about it for my 90s column at Bloody Disgusting.
Certainly not unwatchable.
No, I think it's fine as goofy bubblegum fun, but it's very clear that the intentions of the script are in conflict with the intentions of the finished film.
Agreed.
And I think that is much better executed in the show.
Yeah, and it's really exemplified in that scene where Rutger Hauer's character as this villain is shown with this like really bad makeup and like cheap looking cape with the sticks that extend the cape out a little bit to look like wings, and it's like, well, this doesn't even look like a cheap effect trying to be something more. They're just trying to make the vampire look doofy and silly. Whereas if you were to actually look at that scene the way that it's written on the page, I can see a better interpretation of that scene that actually interprets the tone much, much darker, and treats it with a degree of sincerity that I don't think the movie is interested in at all.
Yeah, I do know this is pretty deep dive, but I know that a comic was produced that was based on the film script that was trying to kind of tie in the television show with the events of the movie better.
They wanted to create a canon prequel to the TV show, and they did. So,
right,
good for them.
Yeah, I mean, it is essentially beat for beat what happens in the movie, but the tone is far closer to what the show ended up doing.
Right, and the Donald Sutherland character doesn't look like Donald Sutherland anymore. Evidently, Joss Whedon had a lot of issues with the way Donald Sutherland performed that particular character. Whatever. I can't speak to their beef, but anyway, the movie is okay, but the show is a lot of fun. I'm actually into the 2nd season now, and I was really impressed with the way the show found a rhythm. I thought that 2-parter pilot was so cheap looking, and it actually kind of discouraged me. I was like, I'm not sure this is what I'm in for. This is something I'm up to watching a whole lot of. But then by the time the 4th episode of the 1st season rolled around, I was like, oh, this has actually found its rhythm and its confidence really, really soon. And I'm here for it. So I'm like halfway through the 2nd season. No, I'm actually more than halfway through the 2nd season now. And it's a lot of fun. The Monster of the Week aspect of it is pretty engaging. the vampire plot stuff, like, you know, just like the X-Files, when the X-Files had to devote stuff to like the alien conspiracy overarching plot, it's like, okay, I get why this has to be here, but it's not primarily what I'm interested in. Like,
right.
Really what I love most about the show are the dynamics between the main characters and monsters of the week, because those are where the most fun and like wacky variety is to be found.
Well, and the show, I think, does a good job balancing at its best Monster of the Week stuff, and in those episodes, often expanding their characters in significant ways.
Yes.
And growing them. It is not just okay, we're the same this week, we fight a monster, and we're going to be the same, at the end of it.
Yeah.
You know, you'll learn something more about Giles or Willow or Buffy as a character in the Monster of the Week episodes.
I just got through Giles's backstory stuff in season 2.
Yes, so I think the show's really smart with how to maintain its serialized nature, even when it's not doing the episodes that are directly connected to the more serialized plot lines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the way that the show introduces new recurring characters is really interesting. Like, they'll introduce them in very, very minor ways. Like, Seth Green's character Oz is introduced in such like a tentative and almost hesitant way, where he just gets a scene here, a scene there, and you're like, holy shit, it's Seth Green. And you'll see his name in the opening credits, like, and featuring Seth Green as Oz. So you know that the show is actually, planning on him being a recurring character. Mm. But, the way they introduce him, where it's like, oh, he'll see Willow walk across the street and he'll go, who is that girl? And it's like, well, okay, I know I'm going to see that character again later, but they really play the long, con with this sort of stuff. And, that serialized aspect of the show, we can see how that's aged. And for the most part, I think those elements have aged well. But you can see how they've been improved upon in the years since.
For sure.
Because, I mean, this was a show that revolutionized serialized storytelling in popular television.
Oh, it was a big deal in regards to taking something that was, I would say this and the X-Files in terms of heavy genre material were so vital for that. I mean, there was certainly other instances like Twin Peaks, and I can't remember when Oz started. Oz was a big deal for that. But Buffy, especially on network television, was showing like, hey, we can tell long form serialized stories and still package it as something that people can get into. But if you follow along, you're going to be really rewarded. And I think that comes to a really good place in season 3. I'm excited to hear your thoughts about that season, which I know a lot of people like.
I'll get there eventually.
Yeah, that the show starts to really recognize and reward people who have been sticking with it, whether it's in references to past events or in just how things have evolved and how the awareness of the characters have evolved. It's very satisfying. I watched Buffy for the first time earlier kind of this year, and it was an extremely rewarding experience. I told him, like, yep, I get why everybody loves this. When I was in the thick of it, I was really loving it too. So I'm glad you got that going for you, man.
Thanks. What have you been currently consuming?
Nothing as enjoyable, but extremely good. I saw the new Spike Lee joint, Defy Bloods, which is on Netflix now. This is his Vietnam film. It's about a group of black soldiers who return to Vietnam as older men to find the remains of their compatriot, the person who led their squad, played by Chadwick Boseman, and also a case of gold, which immediately brings to mind a movie like Three Kings. Coming after Black Klansmen, and certainly in the marketing of the movie, I was expecting this to, have the same kind of weight that all of Spike Lee's films have, but I expected it to have a little bit more of an attitude of some fun, because that's certainly how it was portrayed.
The trailer looked fun.
This is a tough movie in terms of its emotional core. There's certainly early on, as the movie gets started, a fun that comes from the camaraderie of these characters. But the movie is not interested in feeling fun at all. This is a pretty scathing treatise, which, again, that is Spike Lee's MO. But this is something, and certainly with the extended length, that's over 2.5 hours, that I can't come around to saying like, oh, it's like a punishing awful. It's like, no, like it's a movie and it has good ups and downs of drama, and its tone isn't, aggressively cruel or anything, but it's a lot heavier than even I was anticipating. And again, I think that's because of coming off of BlacKkKlansman, which again, certainly had the weight that piece needed. But a lot of that movie's enjoyment came from comedy and a kind of a very specific attitude.
I mean, Spike Lee, one thing that I can say he does so well is if he makes a movie that's funny, it at least knows how to carry its weight. When it punches hard, a Spike Lee film hurts, but you also recognize it like, okay, this movie's funny as hell, and this movie has a sense of attitude that like probably no other movie of that year is ever going to match. Right. Spike Lee is so fucking special.
Oh, he's incredible. He's absolutely one of our master filmmakers. Mm-hmm. And Defy Bloods is that. I mean, this is really up there, I think, in his canon as far as an incredible piece of work, but it is a difficult one, and purposely so. The lead character, Paul, played by Delroy Lindo, is a complex, aggressive, sad character. And one that I am thoroughly surprised is kind of spearheading a movie like this. But it's clear that Spike Lee and his co-writers wanted to dig into some really tough stuff and in terms of this particular character and what happens with him. And I will admit, because I don't want to get off on too long of a diatribe because we're winding down here, but I have never been particularly fascinated with war films.
Me neither.
Except about the Vietnam War, because the Vietnam War was the war that we lost, put that in quotes or whatever you want. But it was, World War II has always been this kind of, from my perception and my upbringing, this kind of comic book, superheroes, good guys versus bad guys narrative.
Right. We've always seen it trumpeted as this moment of American heroism.
Right.
Whereas the Vietnam War has always been this sort of black mark on everybody's report cards, but wasn't your father in the Vietnam War as well?
Yes. Yeah. My dad was a medic, a field medic in Vietnam, and he didn't like to talk about it. And he didn't have any kind of, that I ever saw, remnants or memorabilia or anything from that. And it was clearly that an event that affected him heavily towards a lot of things. And so I never had like this, like, yeah, I want to watch. I never had that kind of typical American male, like, yeah, war movies, yay thing, except when it came to movies about Vietnam, because there was always this tenor in those movies of like, hey, this was fucked up and we fucked up. Why did we fuck up? What was fucked up about it? Mm-hmm. And that is all, from all the way from like Apocalypse Now and Platoon and The Deer Hunter,
even really bad movies like Forrest Gump.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because Vietnam movies get brought up in Defy Bloods. There is a moment where a character talks about those Rambo movies and that, and they mentioned Chuck Norris, who he made the Missing in Action movies, which were all about, these guys coming back and saving these POWs. And they say it was like white Hollywood trying to win the Vietnam War in film, in pop culture.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, and those were movies that never held a particular strength and an affinity for me. I always liked the Vietnam movies that were taking a critical look, that were trying to say like, this was a nightmare and this was a mistake. And what did we do? Like, why were we doing this? And Defy Bloods is doing that in such a way and such a obviously unique perspective, coming from Spike Lee, that has once again added to my repertoire of like, yes, I find this war an incredible piece of history to mine for fiction, because of everything that it represents and everything that's kind of been a foundation for my feelings about war and so-called American exceptionalism and all of this stuff. Defy Bloods is talking about that, and it is very directly talking about African Americans being used as fodder throughout many wars, and what their perception is in pop culture, as well as a lot of other stuff that I don't want to get too into the weeds with this. But it's one of those movies where I knew going in it was over 2.5 hours, and I'm watching it, and I knew it was good because I was never checking the time code.
Hell yeah. I reactivated my Netflix subscription for it today, which is saying something, because it takes a sort of momentous occasion for me to reactivate my Netflix subscription, but a new Spike Lee film can do it. So I'm excited to watch it. I probably will tomorrow.
Highly recommend it, but just no going in. It's a whole lot. It's a lot to process. So I definitely would love to hear some thoughts from listeners if they have gotten around to watching it yet. But we are going to close things out with our
Comment of the Week.
And this one comes from Wal Drumpus, who I love this. He says, I had the worst time watching Dune. I was too grossed out and felt anxiety from watching it. It was never fun. Maybe I was too young back then. I watched it again with a friend years after that, and he couldn't stop laughing at how cheesy it felt. This might be due to the German dub. All I remember from that movie is the Mentat's bushy eyebrows, heart plugs being pulled, and Kyle MacLachlan riding the worm yelling, Atomschlag! Which I want to see that clip so bad now. That sounds amazing. He says, not fond of the whole affair. Maybe I should give the novel a shot. Maybe. The novel will probably at least appear less gross in comparison. But now I desperately hope somebody can find this particular clip that you're talking about, Wal Drumpus, because I want to hear this dub now. That sounds wonderful. I love it. Thank you guys so much. I love all that. We had so many comments on the Dune episode that it was hard to pick one out for comment of the week, and that's a good problem to have in my book. Thank you all so much. Thank you, for sticking around with the show and listening to us be crazy. Like we said, next week we do have something planned for the feed, but it may not be a typical Genre Vision episode. I will definitely be checking in with y'all once I'm moved and settled and safe and everything. We want to thank you all for keeping the show alive and keeping it going and enjoying what we're doing here every week. It really does mean the world to me and Travis. So, as always, want to thank you so much for listening. I'm Drew Deach.
I'm Travis Newton.
And we'll see you next week.
Thank you. This means a ton to us here on Genre Vision.